Morning light eased over the mountains around Forward Operating Base Foxhaven, sliding into the valley in long, cold shafts that cut across the gravel yard. The air still carried the bite of the night, and the diesel hum from the generator behind the mess hall rumbled like a steady heartbeat through the compound. Claire Halstead's converted shipping container sat near the center of the base, its metal skin warming slowly under the sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and diesel. The clean order of her world layered over the rougher scent of the one outside. Her workspace was narrow but exact. Shelves lined the walls, each bin labeled in her careful handwriting. Bandages sorted by size, gauze rolls stacked like bricks. Medication vials arranged so every label faced forward. Above the desk were photos from home, her parents on a sunlit porch, a black Labrador catching a stick mid-air, and a boy with a fishing rod grinning at the camera. They had been there so long the tape was curling at the edges, but she never thought to take them down. On the counter beside them sat a small radio, the volume just high enough to blend music into the background without drowning out the sounds of boots and engines beyond the door. The day had barely started when the first knock came, more of a hurried thump than a polite tap. Private First Class Mason Barlow ducked inside, his left forearm wrapped in a towel already dark with blood. Claire had seen him twice before in the past few weeks, with nearly identical cuts. He sat on the table without meeting her eyes. "Guess I'm just unlucky," he said when she asked what happened. She pulled on gloves, washing her hands as she spoke. "If you keep having this kind of luck, I'll have to schedule you for remedial knife training." Her tone was light, but the look she gave him said she'd noticed the pattern. She unwrapped the towel and cleaned the wound with practiced care. Deep enough to need stitches, not deep enough to risk tendon damage. The skin was jagged at the edges, and she recognized the kind of slip that came from distraction, not inexperience. Outside, a truck rattled past and someone barked orders toward the motor pool. Claire threaded a needle, her hands steady even when he winced. She talked to him about the latest supply drop, about the weather turning colder at night, about the new coffee packs that might not taste like engine oil. By the time she tied the last knot and cut the thread, his shoulders had loosened. "Next time you're feeling restless, try carving something other than yourself," she said, securing the dressing. When he left, she moved through the familiar rhythm of restocking the shelf, logging the used supplies, and nudging the radio dial until the music came through clean again. These were not idle habits. They were her anchor, the control she kept in a place where control could vanish in seconds. The door opened twice more before midday. One soldier limped in with a sprained ankle from drills. The other cradled a jaw swollen from a toothache he had been ignoring. She treated both without fuss, speaking just enough to keep them calm. Outside, the compound had fully woken the steady stomp of formation drills, the metallic clang of armored doors, the occasional burst of laughter from the mess hall. Between patients, she filled out charts at her desk, pausing now and then to glance at the photos on the wall. Her eyes lingered on the boy with the fishing rod. She never spoke about him here. The soldiers who passed through her care did not ask, and she preferred it that way. Her quiet was part of the fabric of Foxhaven, like the mountains that ringed it, and the wind that carried the scent of pine and fuel across the yard. By late morning, the sunlight had taken the frost from the gravel and sharpened the shadows under the vehicles parked along the fence. Claire finished arranging the last tray of instruments so the handles aligned perfectly. It was a small detail, but one she never skipped. The soldiers might notice only that the supplies were always there when they needed them. But she knew the truth, that readiness was built one small act at a time. She understood something few bothered to think about. The calm in her station wasn't an accident. It was the result of 1,000 decisions made before the first cry for help, before the first rush of boots through her door. And when that day came, as it always did, she would be ready. Even if no one remembered her name afterward, competence was its own reward. Claire Halstead was halfway through her morning inventory when the day split in two. The light through the narrow window of the medical station was clean and pale, catching the neat lines of supplies she had just restocked. She was counting rolls of gauze when a thin, unfamiliar whistling threaded through the hum of the generator outside. Her fingers stilled on the bandage stack. The sound grew in pitch and urgency, dragging up memories from training films and stories told in lowered voices. She had never heard it in person until now. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the communications building across the yard. The explosion tore a hole in the morning, blowing the glass from her window and turning her ordered shelves into a storm of flying supplies. The concussion hit like a shove to the chest, rattling the metal walls and throwing Claire back a step. Instruments clattered to the floor. For a heartbeat, she just breathed. The antiseptic air now cut with dust and the sharp tang of burning fuel. Then her body moved on its own. She ducked under the swinging cabinet door, snatched her medical bag from its hook, and began filling it from memory tourniquets, trauma dressings. Ivy kits her hands, finding each item without looking. Another whistling scream split the air. Closer this time, followed by the deep percussion of a mortar landing near the motor pool. The ground shivered under her boots. Through the cracked window, she saw movement beyond the perimeter wire figures in the distance. Too many to be a probing raid. The stutter of automatic fire joined the chaos, the heavier thump of RPGs punctuating it. Claire zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and turned as the first wounded stumbled through the door. Private Andrews, his face and neck peppered with shrapnel, dropped onto the examination table with a groan. Behind him came Corporal Diaz, supporting a soldier whose pant leg was soaked dark from thigh to boot. Claire's voice cut through the din without shouting. Martinez. Pressure dressing on that leg high and tight. Alvarez. Start flushing Andrews's wounds. Use the sterile saline. Not water. The junior medics moved, still wide-eyed, but steadier with something to do. Claire knelt at the next arrival. A sergeant with a forearm twisted unnaturally from a compound fracture. She stabilized the limb with splints. Her voice, even as she worked, "Tell me your name. Keep talking. Look at me." Not the arm. Outside. The tempo of fire shifted. Closer, now. A mortar landed somewhere near the fuel dump, the blast sending a vibration through the floor that knocked over what was left of her instrument tray. Scissors and clamps skittered across the floor tiles. She ignored them, reaching instead for a roll of elastic bandage to secure the splint. More soldiers poured in burns, lacerations, blast trauma. The narrow space filled with the smell of sweat and blood layered over the acrid haze, drifting in through the broken window. Claire's station, usually a place of deliberate order, became a tight knot of movement and noise. Every surface was occupied. The floor itself a staging ground for patients who could not stand. Her mental checklist repeated itself under the roar of incoming fire. Airway, breathing, circulation, stop the bleeding, stabilize fractures, prevent shock. She assigned tasks without hesitation, moving from one patient to the next, adjusting tourniquets, checking pulses, and reassuring the conscious with the same steady tone she used during drills. A blast landed close enough to make the light fixture sway overhead. Dust drifted down in lazy spirals that belied the urgency below. Claire's radio hissed with fragmented reports. Perimeter breach. Multiple contact points. Enemy fighters inside the wire. She met the eyes of a medic frozen at the sight of a soldier's torn chest and said, "2 hands. Pressure now. Don't let go until I tell you." It broke the spell. The young man leaned in and did as ordered. Her own breathing was even, but she could feel the pulse in her throat. This was not a random exchange. It was coordinated, and it was aimed to overwhelm. Still, she kept her focus where it belonged, in the space between the injured and the moment they stabilized enough to survive the next 10 minutes. When the briefest lull came, she swept her arm across a counter to gather fresh dressings, her eyes already scanning for the next crisis. Her organized world was in pieces around her, instruments underfoot, shelves half empty. But the rhythm in her head remained the same. Each step in the checklist was a foothold, and as long as she kept taking them, the chaos could not drag her under. Specialist Vaughn burst through the flap, his face gray under a mask of dust, voice cracking with urgency. Sergeant Halstead, Major Harris is down. Bad. He's at the aid station. He's asking for you. The words landed heavier than the concussion from the mortars outside. Claire's eyes flicked over the crowded tent, medics bent over patients, bandages darkening, IV lines taped in place, blood pooling on the floor in places she could not clean. For a second, she weighed the risk of leaving. Then her voice cut through the din. Martinez. Your lead here. Alvarez. You back him up. Keep pressure on Sergeant Lowe's chest wound and get an IV in Corporal Jenkins. No one leaves untreated. Understood. Nods answered her. She grabbed her bag, slung it across her back, and ducked into the storm. The compound was a blur of smoke and movement. Bullets cracked overhead, sharp and flat. While the heavier thump of mortars worked deeper into her bones, she kept low, weaving between sandbag walls and shattered crates, boots sliding on loose gravel. Twice, she pressed herself against cover as enemy fire chewed splinters from nearby posts. The aid station lay ahead, a low concrete building that had taken a direct hit. Half the roof sagged inward, smoke billowing through the gap, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the scorched scent of burnt insulation. Inside, light filtered through dust in narrow shafts, catching on drifting motes. Debris shifted under her boots. She heard him before she saw him, ragged breathing, uneven and shallow. Major Daniel Harris lay pinned beneath a collapsed beam, his uniform dark with blood at the chest and abdomen. His face was pale, lips tinged blue, but his eyes were clear enough to find hers. Claire. He managed, his voice low and frayed. She knelt beside him, her hands already probing for injuries. Broken ribs, crushed thorax, internal bleeding too severe for the field. Her expression told him the truth before she spoke. You're in charge now, he said, every word costing him breath. All medical operations, 200 men depending on you. You save who you can. Not everyone. Hear me. Her throat tightened, but she kept her hands steady on him. We can get you out. No. His hand found hers. The grip surprisingly firm. You know it as well as I do. Not my fight anymore. Yours now. The building groaned under another impact nearby, dust sifting down over them. She could hear voices shouting orders outside. The tempo of battle shifting again. In the dim light, Harris unclipped his medical belt and pushed it toward her. The attached radio still hissing with static It was more than equipment. It was the signal that she was now the one every medic would look to. She wanted to tell him she wasn't ready, that she still needed him there, to steady her in the worst moments. But there was no room for that. The moment was already closing around her. She nodded once. The movement tight. I hear you. His breathing grew shallower. The weight of his hands slackened. She held his gaze until it drifted, then reached up to close his eyes. Outside, the battle raged on shouts. Gunfire. The distant thud of artillery. The radio at her side crackled with another call for medical teams. She stood, the belt heavy in her grip, the smell of smoke and blood clinging to her. Moments that change a life do not wait for readiness or permission. They arrive in the middle of the noise and demand an answer. Claire stepped back into the light, the beam of her mentor's command, now hers to carry. The radio call came through the static like a blade through cloth. All medical personnel to the command bunker. Colonel Vaughn is down. Critical condition. Claire Halstead was already moving before the message ended. Harris's belt heavy at her waist. The path to the bunker was a gauntlet of smoke, fractured walls, and fire-lit debris. She ducked beneath a fallen antenna mast, boots crunching on glass. The air, a bitter mix of cordite and burning diesel. The low shape of the bunker emerged ahead, or what was left of it. A slab of concrete with half its roof collapsed inward, flames licking at the edges. Inside, the temperature spiked immediately. Dust hung in the air, backlit by the flicker of fire bleeding through gaps in the shattered walls. The smell of scorched wiring stung her nose. She stepped over a toppled filing cabinet, listening for movement beneath the groan of stressed concrete. A faint voice answered, hoarse and strained. Over here? She found Colonel Richard Vaughn, pinned under a massive slab of concrete, his left leg twisted at an angle no joint could endure. His face was drawn, sweat slick, despite the cold pallor of shock. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. Claire dropped to her knees, her hands already moving over him with practiced efficiency. She felt the grind of shattered bone beneath her fingertips and the taut swell in his abdomen that told her internal bleeding was well underway. Her mind tallied the time he had left minutes, not hours. Sir, you've got a compound fracture, probable arterial tear, and internal trauma. You need surgery now, she said, her voice, even though her pulse was spiking. Then, get me on a bird, Vaughn rasped, trying to mask the pain. Negative. LZ's too hot. They've got man pads in the tree line. No air in or out. She was already scanning the bunker, weighing the immovable slab against the clock in her head. The radio on his vest hissed with overlapping calls. Northgate collapsing. Alpha pinned in Sector 3. Multiple casualties. Claire's gaze landed on a corroded metal grate near the rear wall, half hidden behind debris. She had seen the drainage schematics once. During a maintenance inventory, the tunnel connected to an abandoned sewage treatment facility beyond the outer perimeter, a place no one patrolled because no one thought it mattered. It ran low and narrow for almost 2 miles before surfacing in open ground that might be reachable by helicopter. She shifted her weight closer to Vaughn. There's another way out. Drainage tunnel at the back. We can reach the secondary extraction zone from there. His eyes flicked toward the grate, then back to her. That's not in the evacuation protocol. Neither is letting you bleed out under a slab. She began clearing debris from around his shoulders, ignoring the jolt of protest in her own muscles. Halstead, you're talking about dragging me through 2 miles of open desert after that tunnel, Vaughn said, his voice clipped, but weakening. It's suicide. Leave me here. Coordinate from outside? Not happening, she said, without looking at him. You're coming with me. He tried to push back, but the effort cost him breath. I'm ordering you. With respect, Sire. Orders don't mean much if you're dead. Her tone was firm, not loud, and it left no room for argument. She pulled a length of webbing from her bag, threading it beneath his arms to fashion a drag harness. Another impact rocked the bunker. Dust cascading from the cracked ceiling, the fires outside flared with a gust of wind, throwing erratic light through the gaps. Claire spared one last glance at the radio on his chest, still alive with calls she could not answer, now and then reached for the grate. It was rusted, but it gave under the weight of her boot. The darkness beyond was close and damp, carrying the faint scent of stagnant water. The space was barely wide enough for a crawl. She knew the risks enemy patrols between here and the extraction point, the possibility of the tunnel being blocked or collapsed, but she also knew it was the only option no one else would think to use. Survival favored the unseen path. She looked back at Vaughn. This is going to hurt, she warned, already bracing to shift him free of the slab enough to slide him into the tunnel. His jaw tightened, but he nodded once. There was no more debate. Claire had made her choice. Claire's hands worked without hesitation, knotting strips of torn uniform around 2 splintered boards scavenged from the bunker's wreckage. The makeshift stretcher was crude, the edges uneven, but it would keep Vaughn's broken body from folding in ways that would kill him faster. She slid him onto it with slow, precise movements. Ignoring the sting in her arms from the last round of hauling, the tunnel mouth yawned in front of them, the air spilling out foul and damp. Carrying the reek of sewage and metal decay, it was barely high enough for her to crawl. Walls slick with condensation. The concrete sweating in the heat from the burning base above. She clipped the stretcher's rope to her belt, took one breath to set her rhythm, and crawled forward into the dark. The water in the tunnel came halfway up her shins, thick with silt that sucked at her knees as she moved. Every push forward dragged Vaughn behind her, his weight pressing like an anchor on her hips. She could hear his breath rasping over the slap of water and the scrape of wood against the tunnel floor. Above them, muffled booms and the staccato rhythm of gunfire reminded her that the fight was still raging. Every few meters, she stopped, planting her palms in the cold muck to turn and check his pulse. It was still there, fast and shallow. She adjusted his head to keep his airway clear and leaned close. "Talk to me. Colonel, tell me what you see when you get home." His eyes flickered open. Porch, coffee, dawn over the trees. She let him cling to that vision, then turned back and pulled again. Her knees began to tear through the fabric of her pants, each crawl sending sharp jolts of pain up her thighs. Her shoulders burned, her back knotting from the constant drag. Heat pressed in despite the damp air. The tunnel holding the day's temperature like a furnace. She counted her movements in sets 10 crawls. Then a pause. 10 more. Each checkpoint was its own battle. The only way to keep the thought of the whole distance from crushing her. The air shifted before the light came. First, a faint breeze carrying grit. Then the flicker of orange along the tunnel's curve. She crawled faster, feeling the rope bite into her waist, until they emerged into open night. The sky above the base glowed with fire, plumes of smoke curling into the dark. Behind them, Foxhaven burned. Ahead, the desert stretched in jagged relief under bursts of tracer fire. She freed Vaughn from the stretcher, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. The boards had been perfect for the tunnel, but would slow them on open ground. She rolled him carefully over her shoulders, the fireman's carry wrenching at muscles already screaming from the crawl. His weight bore down, nearly buckling her knees. But she locked them and began moving toward the faint point in the distance she knew marked the extraction zone. Each step sank into sand or caught on rock, hair boots scuffing against hidden edges. She moved in bursts between scraps of cover, an overturned vehicle, a low ridge of stone, dropping to one knee to catch her breath before pushing again. Vaughn's arm hung limply against her back, his voice silent now, but she still spoke to him in short bursts. Almost there. Another checkpoint. Just keep breathing. The desert was alive with sound, the far-off chatter of rifles, the nearer pop of a single shot skipping across stone. Muzzle flashes blinked in the darkness, and she shifted her path to keep low ground between them. The heat radiating from the burning base chased her into the open, but the air was cooler now, carrying the dry scent of sand instead of sewage. Her mind stayed fixed on the same calculation she'd held in the tunnel, one movement at a time. One checkpoint, then another. She could feel her own pulse in her teeth, her body moving because she refused to let it stop. The improvised stretcher lay abandoned at the tunnel mouth. But its work was done. It had carried them through the first hell. Now the second stretched out in front of her, lit by fire behind and the hard glitter of the extraction lights somewhere ahead. Survival, she knew, was never about one act. It was about refusing to quit in the dozens of small moments when quitting made sense. And so she kept walking, one unsteady step after another, into the desert night. Claire's boot came down on something solid beneath the sand. A different give from stone or hardpan. The metallic click was faint, but it froze her in place as surely as a rifle muzzle against her skull. Her breath caught. She eased her weight back, eyes flicking down to see the edge of a corroded pressure plate half buried. The mine had not detonated, whether from age, moisture, Or sheer luck, she could not guess. The realization spread cold through her chest. This stretch of ground was seeded with death, and she had walked into it, carrying the full weight of Colonel Vaughn. She shifted, keeping her balance low, and tested the next patch of ground with her toe before committing. Each step became its own operation. Press lightly. Wait. Settle the weight. The strain in her legs doubled as she fought to keep him stable while moving with inches of clearance. Behind them, the burning base lit the desert in a dull orange glow, every flicker stretching their shadows over the sand. The smell of smoke and scorched fuel drifted even here, mixing with the dry mineral scent of disturbed earth. The first enemy patrol came without warning, their voices low and urgent, in a language she knew only in fragments. She dropped into a crouch, Vaughn's limp form pulling at her dislocated shoulder. The pain, like a heated spike driven into the joint. She pressed herself against the slope of a shallow dune, willing her breath silent. Boots crunched past, no more than 3 meters away. She counted 10 heartbeats after the sound faded before moving again. Halfway through the field, her left shoulder gave completely, the joint sliding out with a wet pop that made her vision flare white. A choked sound escaped before she clamped her jaw. She could not hold him with both arms now. Working quickly, she looped the last of her stretcher rope around her chest and under Vaughn's arms, securing him against her back. His weight settled unevenly, throwing off her balance. But at least she had her right arm free for testing the ground ahead. The second patrol was closer. She heard the metallic rattle of gear, the click of a safety being tested, the faint rasp of cloth. Vaughn's breathing, shallow and unsteady, felt loud enough to carry and she pressed her face into the sand and lay still, her good hand braced on the dud mine beneath her boot until the footsteps faded into the distance. Only then did she rise, one slow movement at a time. The minefield ended without fanfare, the safe ground blending into the deadly, as if daring her to relax. But the river's rush cut through the night ahead, and she knew the last trial had come. The moon caught its surface in glints of silver between shadows. The current swollen from recent rains, it ran deeper than she liked. The sound fast and low, like an uncoiled rope dragging through water. She stepped in, the cold shocking against her legs. After hours of heat and strain, the current pressed hard, pulling at her with each step, and Vaughn's body became a sodden weight dragging her sideways. She leaned into it, angling upstream to keep their balance, her boot sliding over unseen stones. Midway across, her footing went. The water surged over her waist, then hair ribs, and she lunged upward, both hands hauling at the rope around him to keep his head above the surface. The current fought her, spinning them toward deeper water. She kicked hard, legs burning, lungs heaving with the effort to breathe against the spray. Every motion tore at her injured shoulder, sent knives of pain radiating down her side. But she locked her mind on the far bank. A fallen tree jutted into the flow ahead. She used it to pivot. Boots, finding purchase on the submerged trunk before forcing her way into shallower water. When she stumbled out onto the opposite bank, her body shook from cold and strain. She dropped to her knees, Vaughn still tied against her back, and pressed her forehead to the damp sand. The burning base was now only a glow on the horizon. The minefield lay behind. The river was at her feet. She was still moving forward. And that was enough. Claire pushed forward along the muddy bank. Each step, an argument between her body and the will that kept it moving. The glow of the burning base was far behind her now. But ahead, through the dark, a hard white light cut the night in a steady sweep. The thump of rotor blades followed, deep and rhythmic, growing louder with each uneven stride. She blinked through grit and river spray, watching the outline of a Black Hawk materialize against the low clouds, its belly lights flashing as it slowed into a hover over the emergency zone. The downwash struck first hot air whipped into a frenzy, stinging her skin and pulling at her torn uniform. Dust and sand lifted in sheets. The helicopter settled into a tense, deliberate landing. Skids biting into the uneven ground. Figures in flight helmets and harnesses poured out. Their movements quick and purposeful. Carrying a stretcher between them, Claire opened her mouth to explain Vaughn's condition. But her voice came out hoarse and ragged, almost drowned in the rotor noise. They reached her in seconds. Hands slid under Vaughn, untying the rope she had knotted across her chest. The sudden absence of his weight left her swaying, her balance gone. The medics lowered him to the stretcher with a precision born of endless drills, checking vitals, cutting away soaked fabric, fitting an oxygen mask over his pale face. One of them glanced at her, reading in her posture what she couldn't articulate, and gave a quick nod toward the open bay. She tried to follow them, to stay close. But the moment her muscles relaxed even slightly, her knees folded, the ground came up hard. She caught herself with her good hand, grit grinding into her palm. The rest of the world narrowed to the feel of her own pulse hammering in her ears. She had not stopped moving, not even in the minefield. But now her body was done listening to orders. Through the blur, she saw them lift Vaughn into the helicopter. The stretcher locking into its frame. Tubes and lines hung from him like lifelines to another world. The crew chief leaned out, giving a signal. The engine note deepened as the bird rose. Rotor wash, flattening the grass in concentric ripples. The light swept over her face once more before the helicopter banked toward the horizon. Vaughn was still alive. That thought anchored her as everything else shifted. Another set of lights came in low second run. Second bird. The medics from this crew jogged toward her, ducking under the rotors even before touchdown. They worked without wasted words, sliding their arms under hers and easing her onto their stretcher. She caught a glimpse of other evacuees in the dim perimeter glow, a soldier with a blood-soaked bandage over his eye. Another cradling, a splinted leg. The scale of the night's cost pressed in, heavier than Vaughn had felt on her back. As they carried her toward the helicopter, Claire let her head sink back against the canvas. The metal frame creaked under the shift of her weight. She felt the vibration of the engines through the stretcher more than she heard the blades. Straps tightened across her chest and thighs. For the first time in hours, she was no longer responsible for anyone's life. The helicopter lifted, tilting gently as it climbed. Lights below faded to scattered sparks in the dark. A medic leaned over her, checking her pulse, pressing a mask lightly over her face. She closed her eyes, not from sleep but from the deep, bone-level relief of knowing the burden had passed. The stretcher beneath her might as well have been a dock after a long swim solid. Certain, the place where you finally let go. The morning light at Forward Operating Base Foxhaven had a different quality now. It slid through the open doorway of the medical station in soft gold lines, catching on the edges of metal cabinets and the freshly restocked shelves. The smell was the same as it had been before the siege, antiseptic overlaid with a faint trace of diesel from the generators, but there was no mistaking that weeks had passed since the night that had changed everything. Claire Halstead stood at her desk. A stack of medical records spread before her, pen moving steadily as she updated each file. The small radio on the counter played a scratchy stream of news from somewhere far away, the same frequency she had kept before the attack. Its constant hum grounding her in the routine. Vaughn arrived without fanfare. He was walking now, though carefully, his gait uneven, a cane in his right hand. His uniform jacket hung loose on a frame, still rebuilding itself after too much time in recovery wards. He paused in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, his eyes taking in the neat rows of supplies, the familiar handwritten labels, the photos on the wall that had survived both fire and blast. She noticed him only when his shadow fell across the papers she was sorting. "I hear the coffee, here's still terrible," he said, voice low but warm. She allowed herself the briefest smile, pulling up the spare chair without breaking her rhythm. He lowered himself into it with the measured care of someone who had learned the cost of moving too fast. There was no speech, No ceremonial thank you. Instead, he placed a folded piece of paper on the counter between them, a discharge note from his last surgical team, signed off with a clean bill of recovery. "Couldn't have happened without you," he said quietly. Official reports had long since been circulated. They spoke of combined rescue efforts and collective action under duress. Her name was not there, and she hadn't expected it. The story on paper was neat and complete, leaving the details of the tunnel, the minefield, and the river to fade in the memory of those who had been there. Vaughn didn't linger after she nodded, just rested his hand lightly on the counter before standing to go. It was the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than any ceremony. Through the day, others passed through. A corporal dropped off a small tin of tea from a supply run, saying only that he'd found it in town and thought she might like it. A sergeant left a new roll of gauze on the counter, the good kind she preferred, but rarely got from standard issue, and left without waiting for her to notice. There was no line of thanks, no chorus of praise, just these quiet deposits in her day. Each one, a recognition between people who understood the unspoken. The med station itself bore little trace of what it had endured. The shattered window had been replaced, the floor scrubbed until the stains were gone. The supply cabinet, once toppled in the chaos, now stood against the far wall, stocked in perfect order. Each shelf bore her precise handwriting on crisp white labels, the same steady script she had used since arriving at Foxhaven. The radio played on, as it always had, sometimes drowned out by the sound of boots passing outside. Sometimes the only voice in the room. Her movements had the same measured cadence as before, restocking a drawer, noting expiration dates, checking the seal on a sterile pack. It was not ceremony, only the work that needed doing to be ready for whatever came next. She paused once, fingertips resting on a battered photograph of her parents on the wall. The frame had been dented in the attack, but the glass held. She straightened it slightly before moving on. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted, drawing long, angled beams across the floor. The air was still, the hum of the generator low and steady. Claire finished the last record in her stack, capped her pen, and returned it to its place. The room was quiet, except for the radio. She allowed herself a slow breath, the kind that settles more than the lungs. Then, from somewhere across the base, a tone sounded, faint but distinct. It carried through the open doorway, a casualty alert. She didn't flinch or look up in alarm. She simply reached for her medical bag, checked the contents with a practiced glance, and slipped it over her shoulder. The shelves were in order. The radio was still playing. The cycle, as always, was ready to begin again.